Good morning. Now that's a good morning. My name is Faith Gondiri. I'm introducing myself because I see a lot of new faces. This is so exciting. Welcome to Concordia College. Welcome to the Offit School of Business. And specifically, welcome to the Lorentszen Center for Faith and Work Luncheon Series. We're grateful to see all of you here on this beautiful October day. Wintry October day. Lorentszen Center convenes conversations about leadership and work with a particular focus on ethics and values and faith and spirituality and all those keywords you see over there. The goal being to enhance all of our capacity and ability to be values-based leaders. And today we're very blessed to have guests from our tri-college partner, NDSU. Thank you so much, President and where are all the NDSU people? Hello? Hello, say hello. And one of them, Prakash, my good friend, will come and give us the invocation.
Let's bow our heads for prayer. Lord, our Heavenly Father, we come before you with deep gratitude and humility. We draw near to you this day and this hour with confidence that you are ready to guide us. We thank you for your presence with us. As we are getting ready to listen to Dr. Austin, we ask you to open our hearts and minds. We pray that you deepen our comprehension, thinking, and understanding. Dear God, guide and strengthen us so that we may give ourselves to your service and live each day in love to one another and to you. Help us to be compassionate and break down the walls that separate us so that we are united in bonds of love to accomplish your purpose on earth. Lord, you have shown us and given us instructions to act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with you. Let your word be our guide so that we grow in faith and in wisdom today and every day. Father, bless this food we are about to partake to nourish our bodies and strengthen us with your goodness and grace. Amen.
Good afternoon. I know you're still getting served and still eating, but we're going to go on with the show here in a minute. Our speaker today is Dr. Philip Austin, President Emeritus at the University of Connecticut, prior to which he served as Chancellor of the University of Alabama System, prior to which he was President at Colorado State University and Chancellor of the Colorado State University System, prior to which Dr. Austin is an economist and has served the country as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Education in Washington, D.C. He was an economist in the Director's Office of the U.S. Office of Management and Budget in the early 70s. And prior to that, he was an Army captain, and he did service in Vietnam. It's a lot longer than that, but that's a highlight of some of his leadership experiences. And as I said before, he's a Bison. He graduated with his undergrad in 64 and his master's degree in 66. And Dr. Austin will be in conversation with our president, William Kraft. But first, he'll give a short talk before they get into conversation.
Thank you very much, Faith. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to have been invited to spend a few minutes with you today. I arrived thinking that it was going to be the normal upper Midwest welcome. I'm particularly grateful to you for the weather. It's just as I thought I was ready to turn around and go back and tell John Pierce to ask Bill to give the speech today. I also arrived in reasonably good health, and I appreciate that I've picked up a black eye since I'd like to say that the guy outside in Concordia gave me a hard time, and you ought to see him. He's in the hospital right now. I slipped in the shower. The Courtyard Marriott doesn't know where to put the bars that you hold on to, but we'll get through this and then we'll do the lawsuit later. But as Faith suggested, Bill and I had a very nice breakfast yesterday, and the format, which I think is probably better than me talking for a long time, is just to hit a few highlights and then attempt to respond to his questions, who would be in a better position to anticipate what issues of interest are in this room. The topic that I've been assigned is leadership of public institutions in challenging times. And let me say right off the bat that I do not take this as an opportunity to slam. Pardon me? Okay. I do not take this as an assignment to slam Donald Trump. Full disclosure, I'm no fan of President Trump, but I also was no fan of Hillary Clinton, and I voted the last time, and I have voted ever since I've been eligible to, but I left the presidential slot open. I was very distressed. I believe that the challenge that we're facing these days existed before the 2016 election, and I think when President Trump leaves office, the challenge will probably still be there for another 10 or 20 or 30 years. Everybody's mad. The prevailing view, at least 40% of them, of the electorate, believe that government has been unresponsive, that taxes are too high. No one likes the Congress, but the phenomenon recently has been, for as long as I've been involved in this public university business, the Congress is inept and not being responsive, but we keep electing our own congressmen. And so the phenomenon goes on and on and on. Now that started to change with the Tea Party activity a few years ago. And in my opinion, one of the real losses of that activity was to get a U.S. Senator who I respected mightily, Dick Lugar from Indiana, who was a solid conservative, but very thoughtful, chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and respected on both sides of the aisle. And a Tea Party candidate blew him out of the water. And then Joe Donnelly, a Democrat, beat the Tea Party candidate in the fall. You would think that that, having happened also in Utah and several other places, would have moderated the behavior to some degree. But it didn't. It goes on there, and now you have a similar phenomenon on the left-hand side of the ledger, where Bernie Sanders, God bless him, and Senator Harris from California, Cory Booker from New Jersey, who's the other? There are four. Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts. And they're saying we're now going to push the Democrats even further to the left. And this just reinforces the old notion of, if you're in our party and we see you talking to someone in the other party, you're ostracized. Everybody leaves town on Thursday. They come back Monday afternoon. A long time ago, I worked in Washington for about 7 years, and one of my jobs was to go to Congress and testify on behalf of the E part of HEW. And I remember a congressman from here, Al Quie, who later was your governor, was the ranking member of the Education Committee, and a man named Johnny Bradamus from what they call the Notre Dame district in Indiana. He was the chair of the committee. And there'd be, those things, the members don't go unless there's a lot of television and whatever, but the co-chairs, or the chair and ranking member were always there. And not only were they friendly and collegial, after the formal hearings were over, they'd invite me to the back room to socialize a bit. It was a wonderful environment. I'm told that no longer exists in any way, and particularly among the people on the sides. And so things just don't get done. And there's no trust. And some way or another, I have to work into here ethics. As I understand it, the man who endowed this lecture series had a concern about ethics and integrity in operations. And I'm talking about the public today. And I would say, I'm not a minister, I'm not a preacher, so I'm not going to give a sermon, but I will say that if you put it all together, one necessary condition is to proceed with some ethical guideline and a sense of integrity. And to put meaning into that word, you have to have respect, and you have to have trust. And whether it's a business deal, shaking a hand and before all of the contracts are finalized by the attorneys, the two principals really have to trust each other, I would think. That most certainly is the case with these two gentlemen down here who run two institutions that I respect mightily and have since I was a child. If you don't proceed in a manner where people can think that you're being honest, and when you say something, you mean it, and it's backed by the facts, once you lose that, you don't raise money from private donors. Legislators don't pay attention to you. Your congressional delegation doesn't pay attention to you. Closer to home, why would faculty have any respect for you to pay attention? So I think it's a necessary condition to lead institutions. Well, leadership of public institutions in challenging time, if my assessment of the national and state political situations and economic situations are as I just described, then the jobs that these men still have, and I used to have, become increasingly difficult, if not close to impossible. If your objective is not just to manage, but to lead and enhance and improve quality and serve the students who come to you, and serve, in the case of a public institution, serve the citizens of the state and the taxpayers who are, in large measure, paying for the place. And how do we get out of this? Well, I'm not a scholar of business, but I have an avocational interest in it, and I love studying about successful people, and one of my favorites, and I'm sure many of you in this room, is Warren Buffett, who doesn't try to be fancy. He just talks common sense and wisdom. And he has been saying for the last 3 or 4 years, as many of the other leaders have been wringing their hands, that he's got more confidence in the future of this country right now than he has had in years. And you know, he's buying up railroads, and he's continuing his investments in Coke, and the failing Washington Post, the fake news Washington Post. He's still sticking in there with Jeff Bezos, who has now redefined the Washington Post. And Buffett's answer to why all of this is happening is because of the Constitution. He said, you know, if you don't have the capacity to enforce contracts, you've lost it. You can't enforce contracts if you don't have facts and a common definition of terms. Truth matters, and facts matter, and there is no such thing as legitimate fake news. Fake news is fake, and there are facts and data. And at some point, we have to insist that people who talk otherwise are not rewarded, because the very Constitution and the rules that have created this country where free enterprise can flourish, and people like Bezos and Gates and Buffett and others, whether in Buffett's case he's investing and trading paper, or in the others where they were entrepreneurial, inventive geniuses, that's what has been the character of this entire country. And so I become terribly disturbed when I hear people talking about the FBI are a bunch of crooks. The Justice Department is whatever. The news is fake. I tell my friends, you know, you really ought to shut off MSNBC and Fox News because they're reinforcing pre-existing biases rather than informing, in my opinion. I try to read the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and the local paper in Connecticut every day under the assumption that they're intelligent, they're not fake news. The Journal is an informed, very conservative perspective on the editorial page. The New York Times is a very liberal, informed opinion. And it's remarkable if you read just the news coverage and the rest of the paper, the points of view are very similar. Facts are facts. Data are data. And I think the only way out of this is to get back to that. And I've kind of come to the unfortunate conclusion that the probably most efficient way this is going to happen is if those enormously successful business leaders get together with scholars who might put together position papers for them, and they, with their wealth and therefore influence, can force a reorientation of the way we do business. Because, again, in conclusion, the individual elected leaders are doing, unfortunately, what we expect of them. They come, they're representing parochial interests. 50 years ago, they represented parochial interests, but they could also see a higher cause. I found John McCain, appropriately, at times of funerals, eulogies should be inflated and be nice. And I think he deserved everything he had, particularly because of his heroism in the war. But this whole notion of a maverick doesn't really it didn't impress me when he was doing it. It's just, I guess, something to be proud of when you bury the man. But John McCain also knew how to do deals. And it would be good to get more people like that. And my hero, Richard Lugar, who I think was the symbol of an appropriate elected leader at that level. Shall we talk, Bill? Thank you.
Well, good afternoon to everyone. I want to join my colleague Faith Njeri, who directs the Lorentszen Center, in welcoming you to Concordia College. Faith went through very quickly Phil's remarkable resume. I think that you left out the fact that he is a Castleton Schools graduate. And so I know that there are some squirrels here in the audience, and so we want to welcome all the squirrels to Concordia College. And some of you may not know that part of Phil's homecoming tour involved dedicating a new school in Castleton, and so that's a wonderful thing for our region here in Minnesota and North Dakota. And I also want to extend a special welcome to members from off-campus, education, business, nonprofit leaders from the community, and our friends who are here from North Dakota State University today, Dean Brashani and your staff. Welcome, everybody, everybody here. So I want to go back to that resume for a moment, and it really is remarkable. Professor of economics, someone who served in the Army in Saigon during the Vietnam War, government service with the Office of Management and Budget, a Deputy Assistant Secretary for Health, Education, and Welfare, and then, that's a life, right? I mean, that's a life already. And then, President at Colorado State, and then Chancellor over the 3 campuses of the University of Alabama, and then president of the University of Connecticut. Do you see, as you look through and back on those things, do you see a connecting thread across those different forms of work and service?
Not intentional. There may have been a thread. I think it's more a matter of capitalizing on opportunities as they appear. I went to school at NDSU and then took a master's and PhD at Michigan
Hold this
State.
a little closer. Thank you.
At Michigan State University. And at that time, in the late 60s, I would say 80% of my classmates and I, within the first 6 months, just assumed that we would be either doing corporate finance work for one of the big 3 automakers or finding the best teaching job that we could find. That's what PhDs in finance and economics at Michigan, Michigan State, and Wayne State just were, that was the culture. And I got diverted from that because I had an ROTC obligation that I incurred at NDSU. But, and frankly, would otherwise have preferred not to do it, but I wasn't going to go to Canada, for heaven's sakes, as a lot of people did. And I spent the first year at the Pentagon doing econometric work, and then was sent to Vietnam at General Abrams headquarters doing econometric work. And well, before the fact, I would rather have avoided it. In retrospect, it was probably the best 2 years of my life in terms of preparing for dealing in large organizations and complexity and whatever, a greater cause. And then a person whose contract I monitored, a civilian agency from Washington out in Vietnam, knew a person who had just been appointed assistant director of the Office of Management and Budget. And he was looking for economists who could do public policy analysis and was having trouble finding people with the appropriate education and experiential mix. And he said, I know this guy from Michigan State who's just completing his tour of duty in Vietnam, and you might want to talk to him. He appointed me, and again, he was University of Chicago, rigorous analyst in economics, and I just learned more from that guy, and then moved to HEW after that. And it was completely serendipitous, moving from there to New York, because I became friendly with a man who was Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Treasury when I was at HEW. And he was quite a distinguished economist, and I was not. He was named president of Baruch in New York, and he called me 6 months later. I had started teaching economics at George Washington University in the district. And he said, are you happy there? And I said, yeah, I am. That wasn't the answer. He said, I hate it up here. They're all liberals. I'm a conservative, you know, Philip. I need you to come here and be the president and run this place so I don't have to deal with them. And, you know, and life goes on. And I think and everybody here who's connected with Concordia or NDSU, there is a cause that's bigger than just taking home a paycheck. And you're not just educating the students, you're also contributing to the economic vitality and the cultural experiences of all the people in the state, whether they're taxpayers or not. And so there's a certain, I don't want to get too mushy about it, but there's a certain reward that in the line of work that many of us in this room are, that transcend taking home a paycheck. And that would be maybe the connecting.
Thank you. I'd like to pick up on one of the things that you said just a moment ago. We're at a moment in this nation, particularly I think in the wake of the recession, when there is a great deal of attention to the cost of higher education and the benefit of higher education for individual people, for individual students. What is it going to cost me to go to college, to go to university, and what's going to be the return on that investment? So there's a focus on individual benefits, for this student or that student. But I'm interested in hearing, Phil, your thoughts about the ways in which our colleges and universities ought to be a public good. I mean, I think we all recognize that we need to provide the best possible education for each and every soul who comes onto our campus. But we also need to be attending to what our institutions do for the public good. And given your range of experience, I really enjoy hearing what your thoughts are about how well are we doing at that public good? What are the ways in which we should be pursuing it?
That's really an open-ended question, Bill.
It
but
was.
I'll take a shot, and if I don't hit it, you
Yeah.
can come back at me. Perhaps a couple of examples would be more useful than responding with a philosophical answer. I will say, however, there's a man named Howard G. Bowen who died 20 years ago at 90 years old, but he was just such a wonderful human being. He was president of the Claremont Graduate School out in California, and a quite distinguished economist who wrote a book entitled Higher Education, Who Benefits, Who Pays? And, it was a 15 or 20 chapter book, very thoughtful, but a lot of people wouldn't hook into it because there was a lot of philosophy with supporting data. But I think a better answer, a more persuasive answer, might be a couple of examples. The year or two before we moved from Alabama to Connecticut, Toyota was looking for I forget now what the company, it was a huge Italian or Japanese company. I'm blocking on it. In any event, they were going to bring in, the Japanese car manufacturer. Whatever it was, they set out a series of conditions like free land and tax abatements and whatever else. But very high was the way they could intersect with the universities. A, because they were highly technical and they needed continuing education at the master's and PhD level for their employees. They were very interested in the quality of the K through 12 because of the children of their employees. They were very interested in the university because they wanted their people to have cultural opportunities with the performance arts and symphonies and all others. That kind of gets at your question. People who never go to an institution, in the case of this wonderful institution, private, taxpayers aren't directly involved in it to the extent that they would be at NDSU, but everybody has a vested interest, including producing the graduates who are going to be the leaders of the community in the future. And also, since you gave me the topic of referring to ethics, presumably at this wonderful place that has as its mission a broad-based liberal arts education, which, by the way, the public institutions also, I know NDSU does and every place I've been, particularly because we're known for our professional programs and the technical programs, particularly do we need to broadcast rigor and breadth in the undergraduate curriculum in the arts, the humanities, social sciences, and natural sciences, so that you're not just producing a bunch of a bag of skills, but you're sending out and the people who are thinking, and they have a little sense of history as well as a sense of our religious and cultural and political and other traditions and where they came from and where we're likely to go. And by the way, if you have studied a little bit of American and world history, you know that with all of the hand-wringing of the type that I just did up here, this is not the worst challenge that this country's ever been through. I mean, Abraham Lincoln had some issues to worry about. Franklin Roosevelt had some issues to worry about. There was the Great Recession. I mean, we've got challenges now, and we ought to attend to them, and this is when we are here and in positions to influence. And if we just lie back and say, oh, boys will be boys, let the politicians do their crazy stuff, then it can get worse. But that's our responsibility now.
Thank you. I actually want to return to some of your opening remarks there. We hear every day from our friends, from the national media and the local media, for that matter, that we live in a country that is sharply and sometimes bitterly divided along partisan lines. You talked about respect and trust being the currency that we need to use to do our business with integrity and with achievement. But we often see a heightening of differences. We often see a heightening of distrust. What is the leadership role? This is a leadership forum. What is the leadership role that colleges and universities should play in shaping students to become, as we would say at Concordia, thoughtful and informed and courageous citizens in the midst of this sharply partisan time?
Well, clearly, a bit of the answer, Bill, I think, is what I said before about an understanding of all of our political and religious and social and ethical histories and traditions. And what that means is a rigorous involvement and focus in the arts and informal instruction. But also, I think one leads by example. And this is going to require not just a bunch of smart kids graduating and moving out. I think one thing that universities and colleges have not done to the extent that should have been done historically is to provide some kind of formal instruction in civic involvement. It's great to have a lot of bright people out there who would rather watch football games on the weekends than engaging in community leadership and insisting on doing the right thing rather than sitting home and complaining about it. And so I have, at least since the George Washington days, tried to say, now you guys have gotten great opportunities here. We were lucky to have had you study here because we learned from you as well. But you're going to be a source of profound embarrassment and disappointment to me if in 20 years you're not at least on a school board or a state legislature or national leadership. Get out and do something and don't just complain. And I think universities and colleges are the place where that's most effectively done. Churches and synagogues and all other types of organizations can contribute, but where else can you get people at the age when they have the potential and the appetite for learning and learning how to get involved, and what a waste if they don't.
So you talked about colleges and universities serving as a model. And I'm going to ask you to go back and look over your university leadership career. I wonder if you would be willing to share with us, as we think about the purpose of the Lorentszen Center and its focus on ethics, as you said. Would you be able to talk with us about a dilemma that you yourself faced, over those years at Colorado State, at Alabama, at Connecticut, and how you approached that challenge in a way that you look back and see could be useful for us to learn from?
The ones that are real catchy and sexy and magnetic and attractive as a story for this are the ones that really weren't that hard. For example, by the time I was in Alabama, quite frankly, the affirmative action programs and the diversity programs were much more effective than they were in New York City or Colorado. But it did fall during the time I was chancellor to desegregate the fraternities and sororities. Now, these two guys have lived in the South. I didn't live in the South before the Alabama experience, but I will tell you, second only to football, sororities and fraternities for the white power class are sacred. And it's not even so much a racially motivated thing these days, at least I didn't think it was, but it was just a traditional thing about this is where daddy and uncle and granddaddy and all went, that was their social group where they bonded. And let's just say that some of my trustees, for whom I had great respect in most ways, were getting enormous pressure from other graduates and many big donors to the university. But that didn't make it a difficult decision because it was so obvious and the society was moving forward. And it would have been more costly and more embarrassing not to have done the right thing than to do the right thing. But one endures the discomfort, irritation of doing all of the speeches and talks and individual conversations. And talking, in my case, there was a man that going to commit $10 million, and he called and he didn't scream, and as most people in that situation don't scream and yell and swear, but he said he's having some second thoughts about that 10 million bucks. And could we talk a bit? And I said, I don't want to talk to you on the phone. I want to come over and see you, and we're going to go out. I'm going to take you to dinner. We'll maybe have a couple of drinks, and then we'll eat. But you're not going to pull back on the 10 million, and I've got to do what I've got to do, but I want to respect you, and I want to explain to you why I'm doing it. I'm going to explain to you why you are going to be so terribly embarrassed if you even think about pulling back that 10 million. And within the next 2 years, we got 15 million bucks out of the guy. And I will tell you that he was an honorable man. He was not a racist, but he was living in his background. He was living in his tradition. He had all of the impulses and all. And, you know, this is not a heroic behavior on our part. That's what we're paid to do, isn't it? And he just needed to have somebody talk to him and say, do you really want to be compared to George Wallace? You know, this place is so wonderful that I found that one to be easy. The much more difficult ones is if you get appointed to the kinds of places I've worked and these two here are the day-to-day decision-making like promotion and tenure. People outside institutions probably don't even think about it. But the man I worked for at Baruch College, the guy I told you he held an endowed chair at the University of Chicago, which kind of tells that the man was brilliant and he was honorable. But he was chubby and a mustache and always had a cigar hanging out of his mouth, and he wore these little half glasses up on his forehead. And to look at him, I mean, I think he wanted to give the image of a grouchy old man. And frequently, when that happens, there are teddy bears inside. And this guy was a huggable teddy bear, a brilliant, huggable teddy bear. What I admired about him was what he said to me in the privacy of a president and provost talking about promotion or tenure or appointment was the same thing he said in terms of, in front of a committee of 20 professors and administrators, which was the same thing he said when he was addressing the entire faculty. And he did things when, you know, there is the convention to become an associate professor. You have a book and 8 or 9 articles in serious journals. To become a tenured full professor, you have 2 or 3 books. This varies by institution. But it's serious stuff. And altogether, too frequently, the departments and maybe even the colleges headed by deans, if you're a nice guy and the students like you, what the heck? Just one more 10. Give it away. If this, when like in the line in the Vita, when the money keeps rolling in, who's got time to count? People frequently don't remember that the money's not rolling in anymore. And you could be making, as with the Supreme Court, you could be making, when you tenure a professor, a 30 to 40-year decision, and that has financial implications when you calculate the present value that are huge. So every one is really important, but it's too easy sometimes to treat it like a family and excuse the little deficiencies here and there. This man brought upon himself more ridicule and complaints and whining because he refused to give in to the commitment he had made to the board to move that institution to one that had greater national recognition within. It was known for its business schools, so in accounting and finance and management. And I joined him after he had been there, I think, 3 years. And there had been a demonstrable increase in the recognition of that institution in terms of sponsored research, in terms of publication by the faculty, and in terms of attractiveness to students in the metropolitan New York area and Connecticut and New Jersey and Western New York. And the only thing that changed was his leadership and his integrity. And very few people would even know that because they weren't around one-on-one meetings and hearing him perform at places like this and the faculty meetings and so on. And those are the difficult ones because to that person in the moment, there was no reward. All he did was irritate people who were on the side of being nice, and there was no one there to say, attaboy, you're doing exactly what the trustees hired you to do. Make tough decisions and make this place better and solidify it for the next 50 or 100 years. Those, in my experience, those are the challenging ones.
Thank you. I think I have a follow-up question about that, about who gets to be in the position to make those challenging decisions. And one of the things that has changed in my own lifetime, as I observe my own profession and as I look at the people in my family, are the ways in which women, we have two early middle-aged men up here on stage. You're not supposed to laugh at that. Very early middle-aged men up here on the stage. But I think about what I've observed in our profession, what I've observed in my own family. My grandmother got a teaching degree. She went to what would have been called normal school in Pittsburgh. And I have pictures of her. I keep them in the bedroom of her with her first classes there. But my grandmother only taught for 4 or 5 years because in Pennsylvania in the 1910s, if you were a woman and you were a teacher and you got married, you lost your job. It was against the law for a married woman to hold a job. And that was true into the 1950s in Pennsylvania. It was different when my mother became a teacher and when my daughter is now a teacher. I look out into this room, I see women in leadership positions at this college and at NDSU, and women in leadership positions here in our community. Have we done a good job in higher education? Have we done a good job in advancing opportunities for women to be in the kinds of roles that you have played and that others have played?
Well, I think it's the Martin Luther King's assessment shortly before he died was asked an analogous question based on race. Have we done enough? His answer was something to the effect that the progress has been enormous, but there's so much more to be done. And I think the answer to your question, Bill, varies by institution. I'm comfortable, I'm satisfied, maybe others are disappointed in my behavior. I'm satisfied that we have made progress in the institutions where I have worked. But I don't regard this just as an ethical or a moral issue. I think it is a moral issue, but it's also stupidity to not include 50% of the population. Number one. Number two, gender does matter, and for a male and a female with the same qualifications, whatever that means. And it's not just academic attainment, it's not just experience, it's also judgment, and for these senior positions. And I have appointed several. When I got to Connecticut, I had a vacancy in the chief financial officer's position, and I was very dissatisfied with the performance of the chief operating officer, and there was a research vice president position available. And we hired women in each of those three jobs. The COO and the CFO performed admirably. One had worked for me in Alabama, and I brought her up. The other I did not know. CFO performed admirably, better than certainly her predecessor. And the research vice president came from Madison, at the University of Wisconsin. And after about a year, I fired her. And so the immediate argument was, how can he do that? He's not supportive of gender equity. And I said, wait a second. You bring them in, you support them, and whether it's a man or a woman, we should be as blind when we make judgments and penalties as we are at the front end. And she simply was not doing the job. The principal investigators who ran the big grants couldn't work with her. She was a failure. And it's been done to men too. But I think that it's been inadequate. And to me, the argument, well, we can't hire whatever it is, whether it's disabled people or minority people or women. Well, we'd really like to, but they're not in the pool because they don't have the relevant experience. And my answer to that is, well, if you don't start casting the net a little more broadly, they're not going to have experience 10 or 20 or 40 years from now either. So you've got to come up with a way that there are compensating virtues in making these decisions, and you take a chance. And in that little sample of 3 that I talked about, I was batting 63%, which is better than the major leagues. So,
Well, I don't think you intended it, but that's a very good segue to what I think is going to be my final question before we open it up. So I'd ask everyone sitting in front of us here to be thinking about the questions that you'd like to ask Dr. Austin. So one of the things, other than your Castleton High days, that Faith didn't have time to mention is that you were the chair of the board of directors for NCAA Division I. Not everybody in the audience would know this, but Dean Brashani and I both have University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill connections. I'm a rabid Tar Heel basketball fan, as addicted to that as anybody else, and I want to thank you for wearing Carolina blue here with the tie here today. That was a wonderful statement. But given your experience generally, what you've observed, but also that experience in leadership with the NCAA, how would you gauge the health of college and university athletics in our country right now? What are we doing well? What do we need to do better?
I don't think college and university athletics is very successful. The NCAA arose to kind of enforce, to develop a set of rules and enforce integrity in the operation, to ensure that student athletes were students and then as a follow-on athletes. I don't think, and I did spend a 3-year assignment as chairman of that board, which is made up of the 21 conferences of presidents. Each elect a representative to the board, and then that board elects a chairman. And I think well, I know, because we would have private meetings, the dinner together the night before the public formal meetings. And at least half, more than half of us, just how do we get out of this? I mean, it was, the NCAA was created for a noble purpose, and like we were talking, like I was talking earlier about the political system in the country, it's not that they're bad people, it's that the incentive structures are causing people to act perversely, and therefore we have these unholy outcomes. Well, there is absolutely nothing in common between this wonderful institution, Concordia College, playing the types of ball you play and by the rules and the money involved, to what's happening in the Big Ten and Ohio State, for example, or in my personal experience, the University of Alabama football. And where I most recently came from, the University of Connecticut, where we never did learn how to play football, but we were pretty good at men's and women's basketball. The money now is in football. That's just, at Connecticut, the men's basketball program was so successful, and we had just very, very good television contracts because we could play North Carolina and Duke and Tennessee and whatever, and those, you know, the NCAA or the ESPN and CBS and ABC compete with each other, and that's what the people want because they can sell advertising, and so we had good agents negotiate for us. That's really not, that is a legitimate outcome of a process that was intended to maintain the integrity of student athletes being students first, and then, but we're driven by the realities of somebody's got to pay for it. And now, in the case where I just read the other day, Nick Saban, who is the head coach at Alabama, I think just signed another 5-year contract at $7 million a year plus incentives. Well, Connecticut can't compete with that, I'll tell you right now, and I suspect you can't unless I misunderstood the situation here. But it's just going to get worse because there are now the so-called 5 power conferences, the Big Ten, the SEC, the Atlantic Coast Conference, the Pac-10, and the Big 12, I think, that now has 14 schools in it. And they're virtually all of them are distinguished academic institutions, and some of them have really successful football programs. And as I say, that's where the advertising revenue comes from, that's where the power comes from, and there are 3,000 or so post-secondary institutions. There are probably 1,500 to 2,000 that have some kind of organized formal athletic programs as a component part of the enterprise. And then there are maybe 100 or so that are sharing this huge pot of money. And that's not sustainable. And secondly, it's absolutely silly to pass rules regarding academic performance, regarding number of scholarships on a football team or a basketball team, regarding caps on coaches' salaries, regarding the n factorial list of issues that because the board is required to do it, we just kind of like any big organization, you just keep rolling along because you have to have the rules, but it's as if they haven't stopped to consider the long-term issue. Let's do some strategic planning here and fix the thing. And then, well, why didn't I do that when I was chairman? Why didn't my 20 colleagues and I do that? Well, because they're rotating terms of office. You come in, it takes you a year to learn what the inside game is and what really is going on. And then about the time that you say, this has got to stop, you're off the board. Now, there have been some peripheral changes and some, I would say, cosmetic changes that have been made in academic performance, in treating the kids a little more fairly with respect to flexibility for compensating compensating them for the expenses they incur as part of their education. nobody's ever going to talk about caps on coaches, and frankly, I wouldn't support that. I mean, it's a game. It's a business, and coaches it's a market. And I'm an economist, and I believe in free markets. But once again, it's one of those things where you're trying to group too many people who have less in common. They have in common attracting bright youngsters, educating them, giving them an environment in which they can grow and hopefully leave with some integrity and ethical compass and knowledge. But when you start talking, you introduce intercollegiate athletics in that formula, it becomes much more complicated and internally inconsistent. And so if the fundamental bottom line question is, do I think the state of intercollegiate athletics in this country is healthy with a bright future, the answer is no.
All right. Let me thank you, Phil. And now it's opportunity to recognize those in our audience to ask questions of Dr. Austin. We can begin.
Dr. Austin, 60-some years ago, I was a graduate student at the University of Connecticut, one of very few women in doctoral programs at the time. I had 8 unusual professors. They prepared us well to do the things you suggested, and it prepared me for a 40-year academic career. So thank you for the contributions that were made at the University of Connecticut on behalf of us over 60 years ago.
Well, thank you very much. That's so nice. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Sir, you mentioned compensating virtues when you were talking about looking for equity and hiring people who may not have had the experience that others have had. Would you talk more about what you mean by compensating virtues?
Compensating coaches?
Compensating virtues. Can you give the question
It
again?
was in the
Thanks.
context of hiring more women and people of color into higher level positions. You talked about if you don't start hiring them at some point, you'll keep pushing that experience down and farther out into the future, and you said you have to look for those things that are compensating virtues.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. Yeah, if for example, let me answer in the negative. In the case of a male, for example, who had been a quite distinguished professor for 15 or 20 years, and then skipped being a dean and a provost, but as a result of personality and involvement in other activities, like community service or name recognition because of political activities or whatever. It's not unheard of that males, that people of that type, and attorneys who are well known. 25 years ago, many small liberal arts colleges hired attorneys who were very successful and who were connected with successful people and therefore had the potential to increase donations to institutions. And they were smart and good, but they were unconventional in their backgrounds. They did not spend 10 years as a professor and a department head and then a dean and academic vice president and so on. I'm simply saying that there are certainly analogies to that with respect to gender and diversity that may not all occur within the institution, but people who work outside institutions, that those could be considered as relevant to leadership positions at the highest level. And my whole, the depth of my conviction on that is simply that that excuse is going to do nothing but perpetuate the problem. We have to break it someplace.
Is there a question?
Hi, I'm a student at NDSU, so I'm in the an impressionable stage as being a young individual, ready for my future. What would you suggest for me as I to be a well-rounded person, you suggested like social sciences, humanities, and stuff like that. What are two things you could suggest to me as I'm shaping my future and be successful?
I suppose keep doing what you're doing. I mean, given the kind of career I've had, you're not going to get me to say that you're wasting time when you're reading another history book or taking on a special project or so on. But what I have said to people who have an interest in the way Bill and I have pursued our professional lives, not everybody likes this stuff. You know, I enjoy complexity. I enjoy getting in argumentative situations and try to bring some order out of the chaos. That's not for everybody. So the big thing is for every individual, what I've said to students, to find out what your passion is and what your interests are, and network. You just don't spend your whole life reading books and going to get out and get involved with other people, and so you can learn what your interests are, and then go after them. It'll talk to people within your passion lane and do what they've done and support each other. But what you're doing is fundamental to everything else. You have to you get that formal education and then keep learning after you've done that.
I am conscious of two things. One is that it's time to finish. The other is that we're sitting together here this afternoon at a Lutheran liberal arts college, where from our founding we have been attuned to the idea of vocation, that we are called to take our gifts, our experiences, and apply them to the greater good, to the well-being of our neighbor. And Phil, as I both look at your resume and have the privilege of listening to you, I can see again and again that you have and continue to answer that call for the good of your neighbors in many different parts of the United States and around the world. Every one of us in this room is the better for your service. So would you please join me as we conclude here in thanking Dr. Austin not only for speaking to us today and schlepping out here from the warm, balmy places in Connecticut to the upper Midwest, not only for coming and for speaking, but for the life of work and service that you have done on behalf of the greater good. Please join me in thanking Dr. Austin.
Thank you all for coming, and hope to see you November 8th, right here, same time.